Solve this, and I'll give you $155 million, he sneered, sliding the tablet across the table like it was a joke, like it was bait, like it was something no one in that room would dare to touch, especially not her. And the laughter came quickly, low at first, then louder, rippling through the polished air of the Meridian room as crystal glasses caught the amber glow of chandelier light, and the faint hum of jazz drifted through conversations worth more than most people's lifetimes. Because in that room, power didn't whisper, it performed, and Rashid Al-Mansour knew exactly how to command a stage. A billionaire built on shipping empires and algorithmic precision, dressed in a suit so sharply tailored it seemed engineered, his presence alone bending attention toward him as if gravity worked differently around men like him. And yet in that moment, all eyes turned not to the deal, not to the numbers, but to the woman standing beside the table holding a silver tray, Naomi Carter, 27, 5'6", calm posture, steady hands. The kind of presence people overlooked because it didn't demand anything. It simply existed. And in a place like this, existing quietly was often mistaken for knowing nothing. She had been invisible all night, refilling glasses, adjusting place settings, moving between million-dollar conversations like a ghost trained not to interrupt the living. But she heard everything, every projection, every inflated claim, every overlooked risk buried beneath confident voices and curated data. And when her eyes lingered just a second too long on the tablet in Rashid's hand, that was when it happened. That was when he noticed, not her as a person, but her as a curiosity, a break in the pattern. And men like Rashid didn't ignore anomalies. They challenged them, tested them, exposed them. So he turned, smirked, and tossed the line that sliced through the room. Not loud, not aggressive, just sharp enough to land. Go on, he added, leaning back in his chair, fingers tapping lightly against the glass of his bourbon. Solve it. And someone chuckled. Another leaned in closer, because nothing entertained power more than watching someone step outside their place, especially when that place had been clearly defined without ever being spoken. And Naomi didn't move. Not at first. She didn't laugh, didn't look away, didn't shrink into the role expected of her. She simply looked at the screen, really looked at it, like the numbers weren't intimidating, like the problem wasn't out of reach, like this wasn't a performance, but something far more familiar. And for a brief second, something shifted, too subtle for most to notice, but real enough to change the temperature of the moment. Because while the room saw a waitress holding a tray, Naomi saw a model, a flawed one, a structure that looked impressive until you understood where it would break. And still, she said nothing, the silence stretching just long enough to make a few people uncomfortable, long enough for the laughter to soften, long enough for Rashid's smile to sharpen into something more curious than amused. Because confidence he understood, defiance he respected, but silence like that, controlled, deliberate, unshaken, that was something else entirely. And somewhere between the clink of silverware and the low murmur of disbelief, the room began to realize that this moment wasn't unfolding the way it was supposed to, because the person who wasn't meant to matter had just become the center of everything. And Rashid, for the first time that night, wasn't entirely sure why he felt the need to watch what she would do next. The tablet did not move, not yet, because Naomi's hands were still wrapped around the weight of the silver tray, the quiet discipline of years spent learning when to act and when to remain still, pressing gently against her instincts. But inside her mind something else was happening entirely, something faster than the room, faster than the assumptions stacked against her. She was already reading the structure of the problem, the layout of numbers arranged in clean rows that pretended to be flawless, the kind of model that impressed people who trusted appearances. But Naomi had learned a long time ago that numbers did not lie. People did, and systems built by confident men often carried the blind spots of their creators. And as the silence stretched, her eyes traced the pattern again, not hurried, not uncertain, just deliberate, while around her the room tried to decide whether this was awkward or entertaining. One investor leaned back with a smirk, whispering something under his breath about wasted time. Another checked his watch, impatient, because in rooms like this, seconds were currency, and attention was even more expensive. And yet Rashid did not interrupt. He watched, his expression shifting just slightly, curiosity edging into something sharper, Because he had seen hesitation before, he had seen fear, but this was neither, and that unsettled him more than he would ever admit. Naomi finally set the tray down on the edge of the table with a soft, controlled motion, the kind that did not ask for permission but did not challenge authority either. It simply existed, and for the first time that evening, she stepped closer to the center of the conversation, not fully inside it, but no longer outside. Her voice, when it came, was calm, even, not loud enough to dominate the room, but clear enough that no one could pretend they did not hear it. She asked a question instead of giving an answer. Is this model assuming fixed fuel rates across all seasonal routes? And the question landed differently than expected, not defensive, not naive, but precise, technical in a way that did not belong to someone they had dismissed moments ago. The chief financial officer blinked, caught off guard, fingers pausing over his tablet as he processed what she had said. Rashid's eyes narrowed slightly, his posture adjusting. Because that was not the kind of question someone guessed. That was the kind of question someone understood. Naomi did not wait for approval. She continued, pointing gently at a section of the screen, her movements measured, respectful, but unafraid. Because if it is, then the projection here does not account for winter volatility in the northern shipping lanes, and that shifts your cost baseline by at least 8% over 12 months. The room did not laugh this time. The words did not bounce off polished walls and disappear. They stayed, hanging in the air like something fragile and dangerous at the same time. The chief financial officer tapped rapidly, pulling up the underlying dataset, his jaw tightening as he scrolled, cross-checking, recalculating, and Naomi continued, not faster, not louder, just steady. Also, this routing sequence duplicates port entry costs between Charleston and Newark. It looks small, but over volume, it compounds, and if labor disruptions are not factored in, your margin compression is worse than what this model shows. Someone shifted in their chair. Another leaned forward, the energy in the room tightening, not with excitement, but with realization, because this was no longer a performance. This was exposure. Rashid did not speak. He did not interrupt. He simply watched, and for the first time that evening, the control he carried so easily began to slip. Not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough that those closest to him felt it. The kind of shift that does not announce itself. It reveals itself in silence. The chief financial officer finally stopped typing, his screen filled with recalculated numbers that did not match what had been presented earlier. His voice when he spoke was quieter than before, stripped of certainty. She is correct. And that was the moment the room changed, not with noise, but with absence of it. The absence of laughter, the absence of arrogance, the absence of assumptions that had filled the space only minutes ago. And Naomi stepped back slightly, not claiming the spotlight, not asking for recognition, her hands returning calmly to the edge of the table, because she had not done this to prove a point. She had done it because the answer was there, and she knew how to see it. And as Rashid looked at her now, really looked at her, not as a role, not as a background presence, but as something he had completely misjudged, the realization settled slowly, heavily, like something he could not simply brush aside. Because in a room built on power, control, and perception, the one person who had none of those things had just changed everything without raising her voice. And for the first time in a very long time, Rashid Al-Mansour did not have the next move. No one spoke immediately after the confirmation, not because they did not have words, but because the weight of what had just happened demanded something rarer than reaction. It demanded recalibration. And in rooms like this, where every sentence was usually polished for advantage, silence was the only honest response left. The chief financial officer leaned back slowly, eyes still fixed on the revised projections as if staring at them long enough might change them back. But numbers did not care about pride, and neither did truth. One of the investors cleared his throat, then stopped, unsure whether to acknowledge what had just unfolded or pretend it had not disrupted the carefully constructed narrative of the evening. Because moments like this did not just challenge a deal, they challenged hierarchy, and hierarchy was the one thing everyone in that room quietly depended on. Naomi did not rush to fill the silence. She did not explain further, did not expand her point to impress or defend. She simply stepped back half a pace, her posture returning to what it had been before, composed, neutral, almost invisible again. But the difference now was that invisibility no longer meant absence. It meant restraint, and Rashid understood that difference more than anyone else in that moment. His fingers, which had been resting confidently on the edge of the table all night, now tightened slightly as he looked at the screen, then at Naomi, then back at the screen again, recalculating not just the deal, but the assumptions he had carried into the room, because power was not just about controlling outcomes. It was about recognizing when control had shifted, and right now, it had, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. He leaned forward slightly, the movement small but significant, as if closing the distance between himself and the truth he could no longer ignore. "Walk me through it," he said, his voice lower now. Not a command, not a challenge, but something closer to respect trying to find its place in unfamiliar territory. Naomi hesitated for the briefest moment, not out of fear, but out of habit. Years of knowing when to speak and when to remain silent did not disappear in an instant. But something in the room had changed, something that gave her permission she had never been offered before. She reached for the tablet carefully, not grabbing it, not asserting ownership, but accepting the invitation that had been placed in front of her. Her fingers moved across the screen with quiet precision, pulling up layers of data that most people in the room had not even considered examining. "The model assumes stability where there is none," she said, her tone steady. "Fuel pricing in the northern corridor spikes between December and February, but the algorithm smooths it out as if it is constant, which makes your cost projections look stronger than they actually are." She scrolled again, highlighting another section. "And here, the routing logic repeats entry fees across overlapping ports. It is subtle, but over thousands of shipments, it compounds into a significant loss." Rashid watched closely, not interrupting, not dismissing, his attention now fully anchored in what she was showing, because this was no longer about proving her wrong. It was about understanding how she had seen something his entire team had missed. Naomi continued, her voice never rising, never seeking approval. "If labor disruptions occur, which they statistically do in at least 2 of these ports annually, your margins compress further, and the risk profile of this acquisition changes completely." The room listened differently now, not as observers of a spectacle, but as participants in a correction. One of the legal advisors leaned in, whispering to a colleague as they began recalculating contract implications. Another investor nodded slowly, the kind of nod that acknowledged both the problem and the person who had uncovered it. Rashid exhaled quietly, a controlled release of tension that only someone paying close attention would notice, because what Naomi had done was not just point out an error. She had revealed a blind spot in a system he trusted, and in doing so, she had done something far more valuable than winning a moment. She had protected an outcome, and in his world, that was everything. He sat back again, but this time there was no smirk, no performance, just a man processing a reality he had not anticipated. "What is your name?" he asked, the question simple, but the weight behind it unmistakable, because for the first time that evening, he was not asking out of politeness or obligation. He was asking because it mattered. Naomi met his gaze, not with defiance, not with submission, but with clarity. "Naomi Carter," she said, and the room absorbed it, not as a label, not as a role, but as an identity that had just redefined itself in front of them. And in that moment, something subtle but permanent shifted, because power had not been taken, it had been revealed, and once revealed, it could not be unseen. The name lingered in the air longer than expected, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it now carried weight it had not carried before. Naomi Carter was no longer just a name stitched onto a uniform. It was a name attached to a correction, to clarity, to a moment that had quietly redirected a decision worth more than most people in that room would see in a lifetime. And Rashid did not look away after she said it. He held the moment, studying her not with skepticism, but with something far more deliberate, something closer to recalculating a variable he had previously ignored. Because men like him did not rise by overlooking patterns, they rose by recognizing them. And Naomi had just become one. "Naomi Carter," he repeated, not loudly, not theatrically, but as if committing it to memory, and that alone shifted the room again. Because when someone like Rashid repeated your name, it meant you had entered his awareness in a way that could not be undone. One of the senior partners leaned toward the chief financial officer, whispering quickly, already discussing adjustments, already thinking in terms of damage control and opportunity, because that was how these rooms worked. They adapted fast. They moved forward even when the ground beneath them had just shifted, but Rashid did not rush. He did not pivot immediately into business strategy. Instead, he reached for the tablet again, not to take it back, but to look at it differently, to see what she had seen, his fingers, scrolling through the model with slower, more deliberate movements than before, each swipe less confident than the last, because confidence built on incomplete information was no longer useful. "How long did it take you to see that?" he asked finally, his voice measured. And Naomi did not answer right away, not because she needed time, but because the question itself felt unfamiliar. No one had ever asked her that in a room like this. No one had ever cared about how she thought, only about how she served. "A few seconds," she said simply, and the honesty of it landed harder than any exaggeration could have. A few people exchanged glances, not impressed in the way they usually were by polished presentations, but unsettled, because what she described was not effort, it was instinct, and instinct could not be easily taught. Rashid let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but without humor, more like recognition. "My team has been working on this model for 3 weeks," he said, not as a defense, not as an excuse, but as a statement of reality that now sounded different even to him. Naomi did not respond to that. She did not diminish their work, did not elevate her own. She simply stood there, grounded in what she knew without needing to prove anything further, and that restraint spoke louder than any explanation. The room shifted again, not back to what it had been, but forward into something less certain, more honest. One of the investors straightened in his seat, now looking at Naomi with interest instead of dismissal. Another quietly set his phone down, no longer distracted, because the hierarchy they had all accepted without question had just been disrupted in a way that could not be ignored. Rashid set the tablet down carefully this time, not sliding it, not tossing it, but placing it flat against the table as if acknowledging its new significance. "You saved me from making a very expensive mistake," he said, and there was no sarcasm in his tone, no edge, just clarity, and in a room where billions were discussed casually, the acknowledgement of a mistake carried more weight than the mistake itself. Naomi met his gaze again, calm, steady. "I just pointed out what was there," she replied, and that was the difference. Rashid thought, between someone who performed intelligence and someone who possessed it. One needed recognition, the other did not, and for a brief moment, he said nothing, because there was nothing to add that would not diminish what had already been revealed. The room waited, not for entertainment, not for conflict, but for direction, because that was what they were used to receiving from him. But this time, Rashid did something different. He leaned back, not in dominance, not in control, but in consideration, his mind moving through possibilities that had not existed 10 minutes ago, because Naomi Carter was no longer an interruption. She was now a factor, and factors changed outcomes. "Stay," he said finally, not as an order, but as an invitation, subtle but unmistakable. And for the first time that evening, Naomi was not just allowed to be in the room. She was being asked to remain in it, not as staff, but as someone whose presence now mattered. And as the soft hum of the room slowly returned, it was no longer the same room it had been before, because something fundamental had shifted, not in volume, not in spectacle, but in truth, and truth, once seen, had a way of rewriting everything that followed. The invitation did not echo. It settled, quiet but undeniable, and for a moment Naomi did not move, not because she did not understand what he meant, but because moments like this did not belong to her world. They did not happen to people who wore pressed aprons and memorized table numbers instead of boardroom hierarchies. Yet something in Rashid's tone made it clear that this was not temporary, not a passing acknowledgement. It was a shift in position, and positions, once changed in rooms like this, rarely returned to what they were before. Naomi nodded slightly, not overly eager, not hesitant, just accepting what had been placed in front of her, and she remained standing beside the table, no longer holding the tray, no longer orbiting the conversation, but now part of its center. The chief financial officer adjusted his glasses and leaned forward again, this time directing his attention toward Naomi instead of past her. "If the seasonal volatility is recalculated, What does that do to the projected return over 5 years? He asked, and the question carried something new. Not dismissal, not testing, but engagement. Naomi stepped closer again, her focus returning to the data as naturally as if she had been part of the team all along. It compresses your margin in the first 18 months, but if you adjust routing logic and renegotiate port contracts early, you can stabilize by year 3, she said, her tone steady, precise, and the chief financial officer nodded slowly, already thinking through the implications, because now the conversation had shifted from whether she was correct to how her insight could be applied. One of the investors leaned forward, his earlier amusement gone, replaced by curiosity. And the labor disruptions, he asked, how would you hedge against that risk? Naomi did not hesitate. Diversify entry points and build redundancy into the routing algorithm. It will cost more upfront, but it protects long-term stability, she replied, and there was no performance in her delivery, no attempt to impress, just clarity. And that clarity began to ripple through the room, changing not just how they saw the deal, but how they saw her. Rashid watched all of this without interrupting, his mind moving through layers of realization, because what Naomi was demonstrating was not luck, not a single observation. It was a pattern of thinking, a way of seeing systems that aligned with how he had built his own empire. And that recognition carried weight, because talent like that was rare, and rare things were never ignored by men like him. He leaned forward again, resting his hands lightly on the table, his voice measured but direct. Where did you learn to think like this? He asked, and the question cut through the technical discussion, shifting the focus back to Naomi herself. She paused for a brief moment, not out of uncertainty, but because the answer was not simple, not something that fit neatly into the expectations of a room like this. I studied applied mathematics, she said, before I had to leave. And she did not elaborate further. She did not explain the reasons, did not offer a story. She simply stated a fact, and that restraint spoke volumes, because in that single sentence, the room could hear everything she chose not to say. One of the partners exchanged a glance with another, the kind of glance that carried unspoken acknowledgement of missed opportunity, of systems that overlooked people like her every day. Rashid absorbed the answer without comment, but something in his expression shifted again. Not just recognition now, but recalibration, because this was no longer about a waitress who happened to be intelligent. This was about someone who had been misplaced by circumstance. And in his world, misplaced talent was not just unfortunate, it was inefficient, and inefficiency was something he did not tolerate. You left, he repeated quietly, as if testing the weight of those words. Naomi nodded once. Family, she said. And that was all. No details, no appeal for sympathy, just truth. And Rashid understood enough from that single word, because responsibility came in many forms, and it often redirected even the most capable people away from paths they were meant to follow. The room grew quieter again, not with discomfort, but with something closer to respect, because now they were not just witnessing intelligence, they were witnessing the story behind it. And stories, when revealed in moments like this, carried more impact than any presentation ever could. Rashid leaned back slowly, his gaze steady on Naomi, and for the first time that evening, there was no distance in it, no hierarchy, just evaluation of a different kind. Then perhaps you did not leave, he said, his voice calm but intentional. Perhaps you were simply waiting. And the words hung in the air, not as a compliment, not as flattery, but as a recognition of something larger, something that extended beyond this room, beyond this deal, because what had just happened was not an accident. It was an intersection, and Rashid Al-Mansour understood intersections better than most. They were where decisions were made, where directions changed, and where outcomes were rewritten. And as he looked at Naomi Carter now, it was clear that this moment was no longer about a corrected model. It was about what came next, and everyone in that room could feel it, even if they did not yet understand what it would become. The word waiting did not land as comfort. It landed as truth, the kind that does not soften what came before, but reframes what comes next. And Naomi felt it, not as a compliment, but as something heavier, something that carried both recognition and responsibility, because being seen after being overlooked was not simple. It required a decision, and decisions had consequences. especially in rooms where every outcome echoed beyond the walls. The soft hum of conversation began to return, but it was different now, quieter, more deliberate, as if everyone was recalibrating their place within a moment that had shifted without warning. The chief financial officer turned his tablet slightly toward Rashid, pointing at the revised projections. If we restructure the acquisition timeline and renegotiate the port contracts immediately, we can still move forward, but the valuation needs to be adjusted, he said. His voice measured, grounded again in numbers, but now informed by something deeper than before. Rashid nodded once, his attention flicking briefly to the screen, then back to Naomi, because while the deal still mattered, it was no longer the only variable in the room. Adjust it, he said simply, and the instruction moved through the table like a signal, quiet but effective. The legal team began discussing clauses, the investors leaned into new calculations, and the conversation resumed. But the center of gravity had shifted. It no longer revolved solely around Rashid. It included Naomi, even if no one said it out loud. And that inclusion changed everything. Naomi stood still for a moment, absorbing the rhythm of the room as it reformed around a new reality. Her presence no longer accidental, no longer peripheral, and yet she did not move to sit, did not assume a place that had not been explicitly offered, because she understood boundaries better than anyone there. She had lived within them her entire life, but boundaries, once questioned, rarely stayed intact. One of the senior investors turned toward her, his expression thoughtful. "You mentioned renegotiating port contracts early," he said. "What leverage would you use to make that happen?" And again, the question was not dismissive. It was engaged. Naomi answered without hesitation. "Volume guarantees tied to flexible routing commitments. If you offer consistency, you can negotiate lower entry fees, especially in secondary ports that are underutilized," she said. And the investor nodded slowly, impressed not by her confidence, but by her clarity, because clarity was what made decisions possible. Rashid watched this exchange closely, his mind already moving beyond the immediate deal, because what he was seeing was not just insight, it was application. Naomi was not just identifying problems, she was solving them in real time, and that was something he valued more than credentials, more than titles, more than any resume could capture. He leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter now, but carrying a different kind of authority, not imposed, but earned through attention. "If you had stayed in that program," he said, referring to her studies, "where would you be right now?" The question was not rhetorical, it was precise, and Naomi felt the weight of it, not as pressure, but as reflection. She did not look away, did not deflect. "Probably in a room like this," she said, her tone even, not bitter, not regretful, just honest, and the honesty of it settled over the table. Because it did not accuse, it did not challenge, it simply revealed a possibility that had been missed. Rashid held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something to himself, because in that answer, he heard not just where she could have been, but where she still could be, and that distinction mattered. He leaned back again, his posture no longer defensive, no longer dominant, but intentional. "Then perhaps this is not the wrong room," he said, and the words carried a quiet finality, not as a conclusion, but as a direction. The room did not react loudly. There was no applause, no dramatic shift, just a subtle alignment, a recognition that something had been set in motion, something that extended beyond the deal, beyond the dinner, beyond the expectations that had existed at the start of the evening. Naomi felt it too, not as certainty, but as possibility, the kind that required choice, because being seen was only the beginning. What came after depended on what she decided to do with it. And as the conversation around the table continued, now sharper, more focused, more grounded in reality than before, Naomi Carter stood at the edge of a moment that had quietly rewritten itself, not through force, not through noise, but through understanding. And in that understanding, something powerful had taken root, something that no one in that room, not even Rashid Al-Mansour, could fully control anymore. The conversation did not return to what it had been before, because something irreversible had already taken place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet precision that reshaped every interaction that followed. The deal continued. Yes, Numbers were recalculated, clauses were adjusted, projections were rewritten, but beneath all of that, a different negotiation had begun. One that was not listed on any agenda, one that did not involve contracts or percentages, but value, and Rashid understood value better than anyone in that room. He had built an empire on recognizing it before others did, on acquiring it, refining it, and placing it exactly where it would generate the greatest return. And now he was looking at Naomi Carter with that same lens, not as an anomaly, not as a moment, but as an asset he had not known existed until now. The room continued to move around them, voices rising and falling, decisions forming and reforming, but Rashid's focus narrowed, deliberate, intentional. "Step outside with me," he said quietly, not interrupting the flow of the meeting, but redirecting a part of it, and Naomi felt the shift immediately. This was no longer about the table. This was about something beyond it. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of fear, but because leaving the room meant stepping into a space where expectations were less defined, where roles were not as clearly marked. But she nodded once, setting the boundary of her decision with calm certainty, and followed him, the hallway. Outside the Meridian room was quieter, the hum of conversation fading into a distant echo, replaced by the soft glow of recessed lighting and the muted elegance of a space designed for transitions, not conclusions. Rashid stopped near the window, the city lights stretching out below them, a grid of movement and possibility. And for a moment, he said nothing, not because he lacked words, but because he was choosing them carefully, something he did not often need to do. "You saw what my entire team missed in under a minute," he said finally, his voice even, stripped of performance. "That is not coincidence." Naomi stood a few feet away, her posture steady, not defensive, not eager, simply present. "It is pattern recognition," she replied, and the simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any elaborate explanation could have. Rashid nodded slightly, absorbing it, because that was exactly what it was, and it was exactly what he valued most. "Do you want to go back to that?" he asked, the question direct, unfiltered. "To what you were doing before." Naomi considered it, not as a dream, not as a distant possibility, but as something real, something now placed directly in front of her, and that made it heavier, more complicated, because reality required choices, and choices required trade-offs. "I never stopped," she said quietly, and Rashid understood immediately, because stopping was not always about action. Sometimes it was about opportunity, and opportunity had not been available to her. Until now, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a sleek business card, not the kind handed out casually, but one reserved for moments that mattered. He held it between his fingers for a second before offering it to her, not as a transaction, but as an opening. "Come to my office tomorrow," he said, 9 in the morning. And there was no condition attached, no negotiation, just an invitation backed by intent. Naomi looked at the card, then at him, and in that moment, she understood exactly what was being offered. Not just a meeting, not just a job, but access to a world she had been adjacent to but never allowed to enter, and access changed everything. She took the card, her fingers steady, her expression unchanged, but inside, something shifted, not excitement, not relief, but recognition. This was the moment people talked about, the moment where everything could turn, and Rashid watched her closely, not to see if she would accept, but to see how she would carry it, because acceptance was easy, but composure in moments like this was rare, and Naomi did not rush, did not thank him excessively, did not react in a way that diminished her own value. She simply nodded once. "I will be there," she said, and that was enough. Rashid gave a small nod in return, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, because in that exchange, something had been established, not hierarchy, not control, but alignment. And as they turned back toward the room, the city still moving beneath them, the deal still unfolding inside, it was clear that what had started as a challenge had become something far more significant, something that extended beyond numbers, beyond roles, beyond expectations, because the person who had been invisible at the beginning of the night was now carrying the weight of what came next. And for the first time, that weight did not feel like a burden, it felt like direction. When they stepped back into the Meridian room, nothing looked different, and yet everything had changed. The same chandelier light reflected off the same crystal glasses, The same quiet jazz threaded through conversations, the same polished confidence filled the air, but the energy had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, because now every person at that table knew something they had not known before, not about the deal, not about the projections, but about Naomi Carter, and once knowledge like that entered a room, it did not leave quietly. Rashid returned to his seat without announcement, without reclaiming dominance, just presence, and that alone drew attention back to him. Conversation slowed, eyes lifted, and the meeting resumed its rhythm. But the center of gravity had permanently expanded. The chief financial officer leaned forward again, adjusting the updated projections on the screen. With the revised inputs, we are looking at a different risk profile, but also a more stable long-term return, he said. And this time, when he spoke, his tone carried a subtle shift, an awareness that the numbers now reflected something real, something tested, something corrected. Rashid nodded once, his gaze briefly moving to Naomi, who had returned to her place beside the table, not seated, not elevated, but no longer invisible, because now, even in silence, her presence carried influence. One of the investors cleared his throat. If we proceed with these adjustments, the valuation needs to reflect the corrected projections, he said, and Rashid responded without hesitation. It will, he said, his voice steady, decisive, but lacking the edge it had carried earlier, because control no longer needed to prove itself. It had already been recalibrated. The legal team began discussing revisions, timelines shifted, commitments were restructured, and through it all, Naomi listened, not as an outsider, but as someone who now understood exactly how her insight fit into the larger picture. And that understanding changed how she saw the room, not as something distant, but as something navigable, something structured, something she could read just as clearly as the model on that tablet. One of the junior analysts, seated further down the table, glanced toward her, then back at his notes, then toward her again, as if trying to reconcile the version of her he had assumed with the version now standing in front of him. And that quiet confusion was echoed across the room in different forms, because assumptions, once broken, left behind questions, and questions demanded new answers. Rashid leaned back slightly, listening as the conversation moved forward, but his attention was not fully on the deal anymore. It moved between the discussion and Naomi, observing not just what she said, but how she carried herself in a space that had only recently acknowledged her. Because what mattered to him now was not just her intelligence, but her consistency, her ability to remain grounded in a moment that would have unsettled most people. And Naomi did not shift, did not overstep, did not try to prove herself further. She simply existed within the new reality she had helped create. And that restraint confirmed what Rashid had already begun to understand, that her value was not situational. It was intrinsic. The chief financial officer paused again, turning slightly toward Naomi. Would you recommend we proceed with the acquisition under these revised conditions? He asked, and the question, simple on the surface, carried significant weight, because it placed her in a position of influence, not symbolic, but real. Naomi considered it carefully, not rushed, not pressured, her eyes moving briefly to the data, then back to the table. Yes, she said, her voice steady. But only if the adjustments are implemented immediately. Otherwise, the risk remains too high. And the clarity of her answer settled the room, not as authority imposed, but as logic accepted. Rashid gave a small nod. Then we proceed, he said, and with that, the decision was made, not solely because of her, but undeniably shaped by her. And as the meeting moved toward its conclusion, documents being finalized, timelines being confirmed, something quieter unfolded beneath the surface, something that would not appear in any report or summary, because what had happened in that room was not just a corrected deal, it was a corrected perception. And as Naomi stood there, no longer just a waitress, not yet defined by any new title, but undeniably transformed in the eyes of everyone present, it became clear that the most valuable shift of the night had not been in the numbers. It had been in how the room now understood her, and understanding, once changed, had a way of rewriting everything that followed. The meeting did not end with applause or dramatic declarations. It ended the way real power moves often do, quietly, efficiently, with signatures placed on documents and agreements finalized in tones that did not need to rise above the room to carry authority. But as chairs shifted and conversations began to dissolve into smaller clusters, something lingered that could not be packed away with the contracts. Something that had nothing to do with the acquisition and everything to do with what had been revealed inside it. Naomi stepped back once more, not retreating, but returning to stillness, the kind she had mastered long before this night. Yet it was no longer the same stillness. It was no longer invisibility. It was control, the kind that did not demand attention because it had already earned it. One of the investors approached her briefly, offering a nod that carried more respect than words. Another simply glanced her way with a look that acknowledged a recalibration of assumptions, because people like them did not apologize easily, but they adjusted, and adjustment was its own form of admission. Rashid remained seated for a moment after the others began to stand, his eyes moving across the table, the room, the documents, but returning, inevitably, to Naomi, because in a night defined by numbers, projections, and outcomes, she had become the variable that mattered most, not because she disrupted the deal, but because she clarified it. And clarity was something even power could not ignore. He stood finally, straightening his jacket with the same precision he had carried into the room, but without the edge that had defined him at the start of the evening. As if something had been refined rather than diminished, he walked toward Naomi, stopping just short of the distance that separated roles earlier, and now felt unnecessary. "Tomorrow," he said, not as a reminder, but as confirmation, and Naomi nodded once. The business card still resting securely in her hand, not clutched, not examined repeatedly, just held with quiet certainty, because she did not need to prove she valued the opportunity. Her composure did that for her. Rashid gave a slight nod in return, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, and turned to leave, his team falling into step behind him, the room slowly emptying as the night returned to its polished calm. But Naomi remained for a moment longer, not because she was unsure of what to do next, but because she understood the weight of transition. Moments like this did not need to be rushed. They needed to be recognized. She looked around the room, the same room that had seen her as background just hours earlier, the same table where her voice had shifted a decision worth millions, and she did not smile, did not celebrate, because this was not an ending. It was alignment, the kind that did not change who she was, but changed where she could go. She picked up the tray again, not as a return to where she had been, but as a final act of closure, finishing what she had started before the moment interrupted her, because dignity was not something she turned on and off. It was something she carried consistently, regardless of who was watching, and as she moved through the space one last time that night, her steps were the same, steady, controlled, but the room responded differently. Small pauses in conversation, subtle glances, a shift in awareness that followed her without being announced, because once someone had been seen clearly, they could not be unseen. And outside, the city continued its rhythm, lights stretching across the skyline, traffic moving in patterns that mirrored the very systems Naomi had just corrected, complex, layered, constantly adjusting, and somewhere within that movement, her path had shifted too, not through chance, not through noise, but through understanding. She stepped out of the Meridian room and into the night air, the cool breeze grounding her in the present, the business card still in her hand, a simple piece of paper carrying more than an invitation, carrying access, possibility, direction, but more importantly, carrying recognition of something she had always known about herself. Even when no one else did, she did not rush to check it, did not rush to plan. She simply stood there for a moment, breathing, steady, composed, because tomorrow would come, and with it, a new room, a new table, a new set of expectations. But the truth that mattered most had already been established. She did not need permission to understand the world at that level. She never had, and now, for the first time, the world had no choice but to recognize it. And in that quiet realization, something deeper than opportunity settled into place, something lasting, something unshakable, because power had not been given to her that night. It had been revealed, and once revealed, it did not disappear, it simply waited to be used.